Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we embark on a 5-day program on conscious leadership. It's very synchronistic that last week we spent 5 days looking at the new McCarthyism and how whistleblowers from around the United States and different parts of the world have stood up and taken leadership, beginning with Daniel Ellsberg, culminating recently with whistleblowers around the UFO issue, people who have seen wrong and decided that they had the moral responsibility to rectify things insofar as they could. And this week, we want to broaden our discussion of leadership and explore conscious leadership. And I think the point that I want to make, consistent with the commentaries that I've been making each day on what's unfolding in the Middle East and geostrategically around the world, is that nature abhors a vacuum, and so does leadership. If leadership is collapsing in one domain, leadership is sure to emerge in another domain. And as we've been tracking what's been unfolding over the weekend, Secretary of State Blinken has been going around the Middle East, actually since last Thursday, when he went to Israel to try to prevail upon Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government to have a short pause, as President Biden is referring to it, not quite a ceasefire, but just a little pause for humanitarian reasons. And the Israelis categorically not only refused, but escalated the bombing of Gaza, wiping out a train of ambulance activity that killed further civilians. The number of civilians now is over 10,000. And we've mentioned that more civilians have been killed in the last 3 weeks in Gaza than in the entire 2 years of the Ukraine war. And more children have been killed in Gaza by the Israelis than all the children killed in all theaters of conflict around the world in the last 4 years. So we're watching carnage in Gaza. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, and members in the Arab states are beginning to draft complaints and motions, legal motions, taking to the International Criminal Court around Israeli genocide. And so we're in a situation around the world where there's both a collapse of moral leadership, but there's also the emergence of leadership, particularly in the Arab world. It is said by some commentators that there has not been this level of unity in the Arab world since the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. And it was because of the unity amongst the Arabs, in part, as we all know from history and legend of Lawrence of Arabia, that the Ottomans were overthrown and the beginnings of Arab Renaissance and nationalism began. But at every step along the way, the Arabs are exercising unprecedented leadership against the United States in demanding a ceasefire and in demanding humanitarian relief and immediate negotiations toward a two-state solution. We're also seeing a collapse of U.S. leadership in the United Nations, as after a series of vetoes by the United States against any ceasefire in the Middle East, the BRIC nations took a resolution to the General Assembly where vetoes are not allowed. And we see now leadership emerging amongst countries all over the world as they're coming together with an unprecedented both revulsion against the mass killing of civilians and children in Gaza and in a increasingly clear disposition that new leadership is emerging around the world. Now, how conscious it is, as opposed to how reactive it is, remains to be seen. But I think if one looks at the world right now in terms of the filter of leadership, we're seeing a collapse of American primacy after the American century, in which U.S. leadership held sway indisputably. And now the challenge is increasing in every quadrant. And new leadership in Asia, in the Arab world, in Latin America, and in Africa is rising up. And that's going to be shaping immediately the politics, both in the short term, but also the long term. Jeffrey Sachs, the economist in Columbia University, made a recent statement that it's been 500 years of Western domination of the globe. And what is taking place now in terms of the international opposition for what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine, and now international opposition in terms of what Israel with U.S. backing is doing in Gaza, is causing, for the first time in nearly half a millennium, of a new kind of leadership coalescing around China and Russia and India and Iran and Saudi Arabia and South Africa and Brazil and Argentina and other nations that are joining together in an unprecedented coalition demanding new kinds of values for an increasingly delicate and fragile world. So that's our situation as we meet today. And therefore, this dialogue that we're going to be having over the next 5 days about what constitutes conscious leadership at a moment when quite literally humanity teeters on the brink of self-destruction in the midst of not only geostrategic turmoil, but climate disruption on an unprecedented scale. And more than any other time in the history of our species, consciousness needs to be radically upgraded so that we can make the kind of choices that are requisite, in our case, to ensure human survival. So it's in this spirit I want to welcome my good friend and colleague, Tom Eddington. And just to say once again, Tom, you're right on time. I can't tell you how many times over the last 2.5, 3 years that we've convened panels by Tom, and they turn out to be exactly on time. So thank you, Tom. Everybody, you know Tom. He is the chairman and CEO of Endangered Global. He has a passion for the environment, also for nonviolence. He's also a very successful executive coach and successful business executive. And he's convened this 5-day panel. So Tom, thank you and welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And as always, thanks for the warm welcome and the opportunity to bring conversations of importance to Humanity Rising and the global audience. And I'm delighted to have my colleague and dear friend Sean Mitchell joining me today. Sean and I have been working over the last 4 months or so to put this extraordinary week together. And I can't take any credit for the timing of today's broadcast, but happy to do it. And maybe just a couple of opening comments in the context of what you shared, Jim. So if we look at where is humanity in its evolution, and we're going to explore it this week, we've seen over and over that humanity as a species is in its adolescent stage of development. And like any adolescent that gets itself in trouble, the brain isn't fully developed. The adolescent feels cornered and will invite an adult, typically their parents, in to help save them. And we're seeing over and over again where countries around the world are acting like the adolescent and electing autocratic leaders to step in. And we're going to have an opportunity today with Jude Curavan and Richard Olivier to explore the archetypes. And who is it that we as adolescents are calling in as our elected officials? And how do we deal with what's happening in the world? A few weeks ago, we had Marianne Williamson on the program where we were discussing compassion. And one of the observations that really struck me about Marianne was she talked about the formation of Israel, and that there's a collective trauma that exists there that hasn't been addressed. And it's driving and motivating much of the behavior, and rightly so, of the Israeli citizens and the Israeli leaders. And so we may bring that into our conversations as well. But I'm going to turn it over to you, Sean, and we'll invite you to share some opening comments, and then bring Jude in to share some opening thoughts, and then Richard, and then get into dialogue. So welcome, Sean, and it's great to finally have arrived after months of planning.
It has been months of planning, and thanks, Tom, Jim, and everyone. Grateful and happy to be here and to participate. One of the things when I think about conscious leadership really has to do with the heart. When you talked about Marianne Williamson speaking about compassion, so where is the heart now? Where's love? We've been warring from our heads, if you will, and we've been warring from fear. So I would love to see conscious leadership, if you will, embrace feelings of the heart, embrace feelings of love, again, compassion. And I also feel that as one raises themselves in their awareness and consciousness, we also become, I'm going to say, aware of the oneness of everything. And we know that now as a state of physics. So where is our oneness in realizing that we are all not just one species, but one incredible cosmic consciousness, which sort of leads me into introducing Jude. And if I can let Jude speak a little bit about herself as well. If I were to introduce her to you all, we'd be here for the next hour. So I'll let Jude micromanage that on her own. And so happy and blessed you're here, Jude. I just love you.
Oh, bless you, Sean. Well, some of the folks I think on the call already know me, but I'm a cosmologist, which basically means I'm curious about the nature of reality. And so my lifelong journey has been a very scenic route from cosmology and quantum physics to universal wisdom teachings and the deeply experiential discoveries of what Sean just spoke about, the fundamental nature of love and the fundamental nature of oneness, of which we are all microcosms. Allied to that, I was in corporate life for many years. I'm an author. I co-founded something called Whole World View, though, in 2017, because I had a sense that there was something coming. There was a sense of an evolutionary potential for us as human beings on an evolutionary planet, as part of an evolutionary universe. And so I'd like to share very briefly to begin today with what really is emergent now, which very much responds to Jim's points and Tom's points. Because in the last period of time, we have basically given ourselves a narrative, told ourselves a narrative based on the premise of materialist science, which has been a worldview of separation. And we've progressively gone into that journey, which has reaped incredible returns in terms of our sense of individuality, our technologies, But what it's done is it's taken out of our cosmology, our way of seeing ourselves in the world, what the universal wisdom teachings have always taught us, and indigenous teachings have always, and traditions have shown us, that our universe and its reality is meaningful, innately meaningful and purposeful, which means that we too have meaning and purpose. This is our heritage. And yet we've forgotten that. And I think what that has brought us to is a dis-ease of separation. And if we see the world through the lens of separation, then the conflicts that Jim has spoken to, what is unfolding now in the Middle East, what is actually the culmination of thousands of years of separation and perspective about ownership and othering in all traditions and across so many, not all traditions, but certainly I would say primarily in Europe and the Western world has become more and more of an us and them. And that has brought us to the point of unsustainability, because that us and them extends not only those to others within our human family, but to our planetary home. So we have behaved towards our planetary home in the same way we behaved towards a perceived enemy. We've been extractive, we've been abusive, we've been all the things that we know. And I don't want to go into those because as a result, as I think Tom mentioned, we have come to a point where this journey of separation has embodied within us collective trauma. And that is playing out now. And as a healer in my life, and I've worked with many thousands of people in terms of psycho-spiritual, emotional healing, I know that the sort of patterns of behaviors of abandonment and abuse and betrayal and denial and rejection that play from this perspective of separation, we do to others, they do to us, and we do to ourselves. So in that regard, and as a cosmologist, the good news, the really great news is that now, after a journey of nearly 70 years of this exploration, leading edge science, as Sean just mentioned, is coming to stand alongside universal wisdom teachings to show us that that perspective of a world of separation and materiality is only the froth on its surface, its minor appearance, that the deeper reality of our universe and us is unified wholeness, is a universe that exists meaningfully and evolves purposefully as a unified whole, where everything is interdependent with everything else. And so this science, the scientific discoveries of the last few years especially, are showing us these at all scales of existence and numerous fields of research, and they are converging with universal wisdom teachings and traditions to reveal that we are all part of a wholeness. And yet, its unity is expressed in radical diversity. No snowflake is the same. No tree, no leaf on every tree is the same. No person is the same. And yet we are family, because we are all family and citizens of a living and loving universe. So we're at that point now. We're at a point of our collective moment of choice. We're at a moment where, do we choose to continue that old story of the illusion of separation? Or do we literally wake up to remember who we really are? And if so, what then? Because when we see through different lenses, then we make different choices. We behave differently. And that is what I sense is going to be the exploration and the themes of our week together with conscious leadership, because we are all potentially conscious leaders. I know Jim spoke about the elected leaders, but this is an invitation, it seems to me, from the universe. It's evolutionary impulse, inviting us, each and every one of us, to remember our heritage as microcosmic co-creators of the evolutionary story, an onward evolutionary impulse of our universe, which is flowing through us as we are flowing with it. And what this is enabling is a unitive narrative, because we're a storytelling species. This is enabling a unitive narrative of unity and diversity, and ultimately unity in belonging. We all belong. And so with that regard, I'll just pass on to my dear friend Richard, but I just wanted to make mention of a storyteller called Joseph Campbell, because I suspect that one of our themes and explorations will be evolving the idea of the heroes and heroines' journey to the story of the weirdo's journey, because this is a we story, this is a we journey. But Joe Campbell also said a unitive narrative, and he was a narrative master, a unitive narrative is the only one worth considering in the 21st century. A unitive narrative that invites us into profound relationship with ourselves, with each other, with the evolutionary flow of the universe, and the unity of the ground and ineffable ground of all being and the source of all being. This is where we stand, and we can stand together and consciously evolve to the potential of what we can become.
Thank you, Jude. Beautiful. And Richard, I'd like to invite you in to share some opening comments, and we'll return to a few more comments from Jude before we get into dialogue.
Thank you. I started my life as a theatre director, and then went via men's development and personal development into management development and leadership development. And along the way, I worked with the great psychologist James Hillman, who was a student of Carl Jung's, and really brought back to life the notion of archetypal wisdom, which I work with now pretty much every day. And that includes also some poetic wisdom. So I'd like just to start with a few words written by a playwright and poet called Christopher Fry. Some of you may know this. It's called A Sleep of Prisoners. A sleep of prisoners. Dark and cold we may be, but this is no winter now. The frozen misery of centuries breaks, cracks, begins to move. The thunder is the thunder of the flows, the thaw, the flood, the upstart spring. Thank God our time is now, when wrong comes up to face us everywhere, never to leave us till we take the longest stride of soul we ever took. Affairs are now soul size. The enterprise is exploration into God. Where are you making for? It takes so many thousand years to wake, but will you wake for pity's sake? So that was one of my favorite pieces when I started my journey of exploring consciousness and conscious leadership. 25 years in, I'm not quite sure how many years to go, but we know we're not going to get there. But we're going to work towards it. At least that's my intention, is to keep working on myself, developing myself, and learning from others, and putting together bits of wisdom along the way, with an attempt to change the conversation about leadership. That I work in many organizations around the globe, and my colleagues work in many more. And the conversation about what are organizations for, what are leaders for, is so rarely engaged with. That, you know, Jude was talking about old narratives, and I echo the notion that we are being run by old stories that have outlived their usefulness. And the corporate story and the commercial story and the materialism story are three of those that really kind of run the show. at the moment in many ways. And we know there are many thousands beacons of light emerging around the world, but there is also a huge cloak and a huge dampener from the mentality that believes winning is the way, that believes that effectively, if I were to paraphrase a bumper sticker from my time at UCLA, he who dies with the most toys wins. And you know, we can laugh now, but there are a huge proportion of the world, a huge percentage of the population that are probably still interested in getting more stuff. And it's hard to blame those who've never had any stuff who suddenly want stuff. But those of us who have had stuff for a while, I think it's our responsibility to kind of step up, shape up, and look at what we can do together and what frames of reference are going to help us change the story. Thomas Berry said, I think about 50 years ago now, the trouble is that we are caught between stories. We know the old story doesn't work anymore, but we don't yet know what the new story is. And I think, again, the threads of the new story are emerging, but tying it together into a coherent narrative is proving incredibly elusive. And I think Joseph Campbell did say, when someone asked him, well, can't we create a new myth? And Joe said, good luck, it'll take you 10,000 years. So I don't think we've got 10,000 years. We've probably got 50 or so to turn the big ship of humanity around. But certainly those of us alive today have an opportunity to be part of making a difference. And that's what we try and do with my small little company, working with leaders around the world. And I've also now started a leadership lab to really explore these issues of conscious leadership and what creates evolutionary pressure inside human beings, kind of outside, if you like, of the day job. And just as a way of framing the conversation a little further, I would love to share some of the work I've been doing the last 7 years around archetypes. And the archetypes that I have decided to work with after looking at many different waves of, if you like, shaping up the world, are these. And there are 5 realms and there are 10 archetypes here, and they're very loosely based on the planets in the solar system. So there's a kind of astrological wisdom at play here. The realms in the middle, the realm of order is kind of how we organize things, the realm of relationship, how we relate to others, the realm of creativity, how we innovate, the realm of change, how we manage transitions, and the realm of action, how we get things done. And in each of those, with the 10, there are 2 archetypes. So the archetype of the sovereign orders things through vision and purpose. It's the part of us that knows how to shine, even if we may be shy or have certain confidence issues talking in front of large groups of people. There is a part of us that knows how to do this, and that can connect to our own deep sense of purpose and be willing to share a compelling vision with others. And that is very complementary to, but different to, the strategist, more about structure, mastery, a logical approach to getting the plan in shape to create the order, but both incredibly important. In relationship, we have the archetype of the nurturer, the part of us that cares and has empathy, a developmental approach, the natural kind of parental archetype, but also the lover who works as equals and creates social capital and is more about desire and beauty. In creativity, the dreamer is the part of us that really can imagine a better future, and can be inspired to then try and move towards creating that future. And the storyteller, which has been mentioned a couple of times already, is the part of us that can create a new narrative, that can really say, here's where we've been, here's where we are now, and here's where we need to go. In change, we have the archetype of the renegade, the creative disruptor, the inventor, the one who takes huge leaps into the future, doesn't kind of wait for everyone else to get on board, but leads by example and breaks the rules and breaks things often en route. And the transformer, which is more of the slow shamanic approach to change, honoring the mystery of regeneration, the mystery of life and death and rebirth in nature and in many other systems that we meet in the world. And last but not least, in action, we have the warrior and the explorer. The warrior, the part of us that can challenge and defend, that can manage our own boundaries, that can challenge inappropriate behavior in others. There's definitely part of the whistleblower that requires some warrior energy to challenge accepted truths. And then the explorer, which is more the part of us that's about adventure and truth. So what is our philosophy of life? Why do we think we're here? And what is the adventure for us? What is the quest that we hold at the center of our life at this point in time? Because it may change with the explorer from epoch to epoch, from age to age, sometimes even from year to year. So with these 10, the way that I've been working in the labs, we believe that these are 10 paths towards increased improved consciousness or evolution. Each of them has its own gift, and we all have access to all of them. But inevitably, as human beings, we have lived into a certain story. And any story, any habits that we have will be guided more by some archetypes than others. So there are archetypes that we are more in tune with and that we feel more connected to. And any viewers looking at this, you might like to think if there were 2 or 3 on here that you would feel particularly close to, which would they be? It is likely that those are your paths towards evolution, that we are much more likely to be able to evolve a part of us that we've already explored and we feel comfortable with than an archetypal path that we may have shunned or not seen as being particularly important in our life. But each and all of these are evolving. And the way me and my colleague Lawrence Hillman, who co-founded this work with me, are holding this at the moment, is that the next level of consciousness will probably only become a stage rather than a state that we can jump into when all 10 paths have been explored and have kind of come to maturity. So that will require many, many people in many, many different parts of the world to figure out what is the evolving edge of the archetypes that are around you, that are in you, that are in your teams, that are in your organizations. All of them can develop greater consciousness and move into a different state of being ready to serve. What is the new story that will really serve humanity? And what are the 10 flavors that would work towards that? And for our viewers and listeners today, which one calls you? If we're working the beginning of the hero's journey as the call to adventure, but if there was one area on this little frame, this map, that you would feel called to explore, what might it be? And just to finish with an example, perhaps, of where an archetype has evolved over the last couple of thousand of years. And of course, the archetypes regress as well. They don't only evolve. But 2,000 years ago, a warrior would be rewarded for being what was called a berserker, for going into the neighboring tribe, causing havoc, stealing whatever you wanted, coming back, and everyone would say, good job. 1,000 years ago, a warrior could be equally well received if they were a defender of the faith. So we would then give ourselves the right to go into neighboring countries if they had a different faith, and you could still steal things and come back and be rewarded as a good warrior. Now, and you know, we can see from so many parts of the world that are suffering from shadow warrior, that there is an honorable new warrior being born that is about speaking truth, that is about standing up for those whose rights are not being respected, whether that be the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, some of the pro-Palestinian protesters around the world right now, people who are saying this isn't right and we need to stand up for it. So that's an edge of the war. Eco-warriors I think of in this regard as well. That's an edge that is being pushed beyond the kind of classic aggressive person, that there is a way for aggression to be channeled that is actually helpful for the evolutionary process. But like all of them, it has to be done with care. So, Jude, back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. And I wanted to just sort of thank Richard for all the work that he's been doing with Lawrence on archetypes, not just at work, but in life, because they are so powerful. And as you said, Richard, they and themselves are evolving as well. And of course, archetypes have no part to play in a paradigm of materialist separation. They only are natural attributes of a universal consciousness, where mind and consciousness aren't something we have, but literally what we and the whole world are. So appreciating how they flow through astrologically and in this terminology through our collective psyche, I feel is incredibly important at the moment. And so just to add a couple of points on those. First of all, I just wanted to make the point about a unitive narrative. And it may well take a long, long time for it to be really embodied in our psyche. But there wasn't an impulse to come together with a group of folks a couple of years ago to draft a perspective of a unitive narrative. And I'll put it in the chat later on our session. But last year, very late last year, the United Nations, for the first time in 75 years in their whole history, actually formally adopted an organizational structure called a thematic cluster of civil organizations, NGOs, etc., based on that unitive narrative that I was part of drafting a couple of years ago. So it really is moving. And so there's a lot of traction now, very much beneath the radar. But I know Connie's on this course, so she will add to this, on unitive economics, on unitive education, on unitive justice, all coming from that underpinning and framing of a unitive narrative. So perhaps we can loop back to that later on in our sharing. But I just wanted to mention two of the archetypes that you spoke to. One is the sovereign. And my sense of the vision and sense of visionary purpose of the sovereign now is more as a servant leader, as a serverin. Somebody mentioned in chat, what does co-sovereigning mean? For me, it means that instead of a sovereign having that sort of vision and purpose, it is on behalf of the good of the whole. And so it becomes a servant leadership, and therefore what I call a serverin. And I feel that's really absolutely fundamental to how we might step into that evolving archetype as part of our conscious revolution. And the other one is the transformer, because the transformer is based on Pluto as an astrological and astronomical archetype, which is very much about transformation and often death and then rebirth. But my sense of the transformer, and we spoke about this, is that that archetype is vital for the healing of our collective trauma. That archetype, if we can come together and share without blame and shame, but find ways of truth, reconciliation, whatever processes we can, coming from a progressively unitive awareness, then that transformer archetype will guide us as we move forward. And just to finish on this sense of what conscious leadership is, it's far more about bringing what traditionally can be seen as feminine attributes into what has been a historically, significantly masculine approach. And yet it's both and. It's that sense of it takes two columns to hold the sky, it takes two wings to fly. So that integration of feminine and masculine attributes, more in terms of seeing and sensing and shape holding and serving, I feel is very important. And so I'll stop there, but I'm just thrilled that we are here together. I'm thrilled that with all the horror that is unfolding and still unfolding in our world, as a healer, I can see the first steps to us to remember who we really are. And therefore, as a result, we can come together, we can link up and lift up and light up and level up and consciously evolve. This is our choice. And I'm sure this is going to be our exploration throughout the rest of our week together. So Tom, Sean, back to you.
Yeah, thank you both. What a wonderful framing for the discussion today and for the week. And I think where I'd like for us to start a bit is just going back to something you mentioned, Jude, about Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. And that's the framework that Sean and I have architected for this week of the hero's journey. And so maybe if we could just start there with the archetypes and some of what you shared with us, Richard, just in terms of, we as a human species are in an ongoing evolutionary path, and each of us individually are on our own personal hero's journey or heroine's journey. And so I'd love to hear both of you start our conversation there.
Richard, do you want to start us off?
I wasn't quite sure what you were asking, Tom. Would you mind just reframing it slightly?
Sure. Yeah. So with where some of Jim's opening comments and some of the comments Sean and I made around the nature of the universe is love. We all are evolving into the unitive narrative that Jude has been speaking to. It's unfamiliar. We don't have a new story for humanity. And so we're all going through and experiencing the pain of the hero or heroine's journey. And maybe we can frame for our viewers a bit more about where we are and where we need to be going as a species.
If I could add a little bit right in there, Tom and Richard, in terms of the Campbell's format and template, if you will, it starts with departure, and the call and the refusal of the call. So I'd be wondering, Richard, if you could share with us your thoughts about where we're at as a collective, unitive consciousness in the world, and feeling this call to conscious leadership, the call to wake up, the call for change. And how maybe does that fall into explorer category? Does that fall into sovereign category, dreamer category? And along with that, I do have a question. If any of those archetypes, the way you, by the way, it's fabulous. Does sovereign have anything to do with explorer? Do they move together if they're located next to each other?
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. I mean, they all essentially, the way we're thinking about it at the moment, the more that the archetypes evolve, the more they also move together and become closer together. That they're most distinct, really, at the kind of base level where we enter them and where we accommodate them in ourselves. We can be our kind of inner diversity can be quite polarized between them. So there are a lot of people I would work with who feel, for whatever reason, they have to be a warrior and a strategist at work, and they save their nurturer loving energy, for home life. And we're trying to talk to people, well, wouldn't it be nice to have some of that in work? And occasionally you might want a bit of strategist in the home life as well. So the idea of being able to meet and merge with the archetypes, and of course, because it's kind of in a way an artificial frame dividing the world into 10 slices. So there are 100 flavors that you can get by working them together. I have a personal development plan at the moment, which is about developing my nurturing transformer, because I love the transformer archetype, and the nurturer is one that has been a little bit further away from me. But as I come into my 60s and the world is inviting me to slow down and find ways to begin to think about legacy as well as ambition, and the conversation shifts in midlife for sure, and I think the archetypal patterns that will best serve us can shift, and sometimes we have an internal resistance, what you might call the refusal of the call to moving into an archetype. And often, and I've found this in some of the deeper coaching sessions we've done with this model, that is because of an old trauma. So our childhood experiences inevitably kind of shape us in different ways. But you could argue that almost any wound or any trauma is received through a shadow archetype. So the shadow nurturer becomes the smothering carer. The shadow warrior obviously becomes the aggressive bully, and so on. That they all have shadows of too much. And when we have been negatively impacted, that part of our kind of rounded unitive development tends to be stunted. It's like, and secondly, we tend to have a prejudice against that archetype when we see it in the world. So I was prejudiced against warrior energy, and many people are in the world and have good reason to be. Mine was very light. I was bullied at school by tougher boys than me who could twist my arm behind my back, etc. I shied away from the warrior for 20 years. And it was only when I was working as a theatre director and suddenly needed actually to be able to assert myself and working with people, some actors who had very creative but not always wise ideas of what should happen, I actually had to go and study karate for 6 months in order to develop my inner warrior. I hate fighting. I would never ever pick up a fight, but simply putting some of that energy, being able to defend my boundaries into my system, I felt like I rehearsed it enough so that I could claim the inner gift back. The warrior will never be one of the ones I want to evolve, but the shadows, we can notice that the gifts will enable us to shine in some ways, and the shadows, particularly the shadows of other archetypes that have hurt us in the past, become barriers sometimes to embracing the gift that awaits the other side of that.
I love how you said the shadow aligns with refusal of the call. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, it's an inner refusal. It's like, I don't do that. If I notice it in myself as I really try and embrace the nurturer now, that there are things that I have said I don't have time for in my life, and my explorer is very strong, so I'm always on a quest. And that's probably my leading archetype. So, and I'm a fast explorer. I like to move quick, and when I see something, I want to head straight there. So the notion of slowing down, really stopping, feeling the call, if you like, on a deeper level, not maybe just on the intellectual level, but with my whole body, that's a challenge. And it's something I'm working with, and I'm working with a new meditation practice, literally just to try and feel the core of my being more, rather than the ideational part of my being that's run the show for many years. So there's a little bit of like, I can't do that. And hopefully now, I mean, I've been working with the hero's journey as a myth for 40 years or so. So, you know, the refusal comes in many subtle ways. And you know, it can be as simple as, oh, let's just have another glass of wine, you know, or let's turn off that news channel that's upsetting me a little bit. Or, yeah, I'm not going to stick to this discipline that I know will actually help me evolve in a certain way.
Yeah, thank you. Jude.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'd like to also take a step back in terms of the archetypal realms, because the archetypes themselves are based, as you said, Richard, on the astrology, the astrological bodies of our solar system. And as a mesocosm, as it were, of universal consciousness, our solar system is a matrix, a multidimensional matrix of mind and consciousness. So as an astrologer, as well as a cosmologist, and having sort of studied the subject for 50 or so years now, and realizing that when each of us are born, we are unique in that regard, of all of the archetypes all together are influencing us at that exact moment of our birth and place of birth. And they are essentially the archetypal toolbox we have for our personality expression of our earth walk. And so, of course, all of them not just are represented in our psyche, whether it's personal and collective, but they're the same patterns of aspects, and yet they play out individually and uniquely within us. So it's a both and. But I think getting back to that very personal and intimate relationship with the whole patterning of archetypes means that we, as you say, we embody all of them to some degree or other. We're called to some of them more than others because of the aspects they dynamically interact with throughout our whole life cycle. But they begin that journey at our moment of birth. So I actually would invite everyone to have their birth chart understood, because we often talk about the star sign as this, but it's the sun sign. So every one of those archetypes, if we can understand the key aspects of those in our birth chart, we can also help us, as Richard said, to more deeply understand which of those really cause us and which of those do we run the other direction from, and which can we strengthen, and which can and how can we optimize their relationships within us. Because part of the journey of life is to take that, if you like, that base sound, that base musical chord of our birth astrology, and move it, hopefully, as we evolve and we learn and we grow into those higher representations. And what Richard is doing so brilliantly is he's really bringing these now into our collective awareness, because these are what we need now to understand to help guide our conscious evolution. And, you know, whichever of those we're called for, it is that embodiment of their evolutionary potential within all of us that actually is part of fundamental aspect, it seems to me, not just of conscious leadership, but the conscious revolution of humanity. And yet, as Richard, thank you for that incredible poem by Christopher Fry. I loved what he wrote, that this is soul-sized, because this comes back to our individual choices as a soul, as souls. So I just wanted to bring that in. And then when we answer the call, because that was a question, I think, Sean, what is the call? For me, it became I couldn't live my life as I'd lived my life. I got to a point where enough already. And for me, it was an emotional awakening, because I lost my dad when I was very young. And actually, a lot of the hero's journeys begin with a loss, a really personal loss, that then makes that person, you know, not able to continue in the life they had known. And for me, it was the loss of my dad when I was 10. It was other things. So that when by the time I was in my late teens, I'd shut my heart down. So I was refusing the call big time. I was so refusing the call big time. But it took a long time. But eventually that shutting down of my heart, I finally realized that I'd not protected myself from further loss. I'd imprisoned myself from feeling love. And I realized at that point that my mind had taken me a long way in this journey. But if I didn't open my heart, if my heart hadn't broken open, I wouldn't have been able to continue. And that's been the rest of my journey for the last 30 or so years. So it took till my early 40s to answer the call authentically. And it took the breaking of my heart to actually get me to that point of departure and that journey onwards that's still ongoing, of course.
Whether we're talking on the individual level or the collective level, this call to the unitive, what are we needing to have humanity respond to the call? I mean, if we use just our logical brains of the dying planet, the million species that are endangered, the list goes on and on. People are refusing to acknowledge the call, and what's there for both of you in helping us move to the unitive?
Richard, if you're okay, I'd like to respond to that first, because I think so. All my journey for many, many years, when I shared my experiences or I spoke of the wholeness of reality, people would say, what's the evidence? What's the evidence? Where's the evidence? And for those that had answered the call and gone on their own inner journey of discovery, they got to a point where the evidence was, okay, fine. I don't really need that anymore, because I know I have this deep, profound inner knowingness and experience of oneness, of a unitive awareness. But for many, many others, and I would suggest this is still the mainstream collective perspective, we have a mainstream worldview that is based on 19th century science. The science of a mechanistic, separatist universe. The 20th century scientific revolution of quantum physics, relativity physics, it gave us the clues of wholeness, but in the main, it was very sciencey. So the quantum physics was tiny, the relativity was huge. How did it affect our everyday lives? And the way it did it was actually through technologies, rather than through the deeper understandings that it was showing to us that the appearance of our world is not its fundamental unified nature. It's an expression. It's still real, but it's an expression. Yeah. And so it's only now that the evidence has been accumulating over the last few years even, that, all roads are leading to this convergence with universal wisdom teachings of wholeness. I just want to finish with one other thing on the evidence, because what I've written about in The Cosmic Hologram and The Story of Gaia, my most recent two books, are all evidence-based. But to say that in 2022, the Nobel Prize for Physics was given to 3 scientists who for decades had been researching universal unity, what's called non-locality. And the physics Nobel is only given to settled science. So late last year, we had a threshold moment in science saying, yes, this is the evidence. We can rely on this. This is showing us the unity of reality. But the other key thing is that this evidence is showing up at our everyday lives. We're seeing the signatures of unity and the holographic signatures of unity, the same patterns in ecosystems as in the internet. We're seeing it played out within our everyday collective behaviors. We're seeing it played out in that the same relationship that describes the power and frequency of earthquakes are shown in the frequency and destructive power of conflicts, of human conflicts. And it's showing us, therefore, that that underlying causative realm that spills out through our collective psyche as conflicts, we can evolve to that higher level of coherence, that actually the natural outcome of that level of awareness is peace. This is the opportunity. This is the evolutionary opportunity that we have. And it's the underpinning reality. It's the true reality of what is the world and who we are in the world. And because mind and consciousness isn't what we have, it literally is what the whole world and we are. We can choose. We can wake up and remember and evolve and choose peace. We can literally transform our world from pieces, from its fragmented pieces to peace.
Thank you. And would just, coming back to this, that the unitive narrative usually starts in the place of the dreamer. The Neptune function, it's the piece that sees the whole. It's the home really of the spirit, many spiritual impulses, definitely also a home of compassion, seeing the world as one, the non-locality, the non-logical piece often comes through the dreamer. And if we look, I would say, all archetypes have a masculine and a feminine expression in my experience.
Yeah.
But the top four archetypes here, the strategist, sovereign, explorer, warrior, are the ones that in their masculine guise have been running the world for 300 years, perhaps 6,000 years, since the goddess cultures were overthrown by the marauding warrior cultures. But those four exert a huge amount of control and are those most likely to use force to get what they want, which renders them, of course, extremely dangerous when they tip into shadow prospects. The other six, for me, are all ones that in different ways need to be more embraced to get through the big challenge ahead. What Joanna Macy calls, we're either heading for a great collapse or a great transition and the great turning, as she calls it. So the turning literally requires kind of turning the wheel, moving different archetypal patterns into precedence. Now, my colleague Lawrence Hillman says it's extremely dangerous to try and exclude any archetype, that because they exist in our solar system, they are given. They're in our DNA. We can evolve them. We can learn from them. We can perhaps, teach them in the evolutionary process how to become only supporting what we would call a positive story for humanity rather than doing harm. But somehow, the unity would suggest that they all need to be included. In some way, shape, or form. But for me, nurturer, lover, dreamer, storyteller, renegade, and transformer are the ones that need to be dialed up hugely in leadership. And once that's happened, then the sovereign can perhaps have an enlarged, broader vision of a society in which business is genuinely a force for good. But those are the six, for me, where the magic needs to happen for the next period of time.
I agree. And just to move on to that, because I think this is actually even both a larger story and yet even more intimate story as we move through this. Two things, Richard. Yes, our solar system. I referred to this earlier. I actually spell solar system, not SOLAR, but SOULAR, as a matrix of collective solar consciousness. But the other thing was your point that really resonated with me about dreamers and the dreamer archetype. because some of the work I've been involved with has been really looking at the whole story of, well, the whole story of our universe and the whole story of our planetary home, but our story of humanity. And more recently, the ages, the astrological ages that we've been going through over the last 10,000 years or so. And around 2,000 to 2,500 years ago, astrologers would say that was the coming of the age of Pisces from the age of Aries. So there was this sort of spiritual impulse coming through our collective. And others and religious teachers, such as Karen Armstrong, described it as the axial age, where these ideas, these dreamers, came forward with new dreams for the story of humanity. The beginning of you know, from Lao Tzu and Jesus across the piece. But interestingly enough, from the whole sort of matrix of archetypes, the Piscean impulse of spirituality came into the previous age of Aries, which was the age of individuation. And I'd love to understand more about the archetypes that really play through this and their key aspects. And then the preceding age before that was falling away, which was the age of Taurus. So there are three interweaving great threads of these archetypal influences that are working through every age. We are now at the end of the Piscean age. We're coming into what's known as the Aquarian age. So that Aquarian age, with its own dreamers and storyteller archetypal involvement, is an age that is expanding the sense of we to include me and all. So with that impulse coming through, the religiosity, I can never say that word, of what the Piscean age became through its structures, the Piscean spiritual impulse is now finding its full flower. So we get this Aquarian impulse of evolutionary expansion with the spiritual essence of the Piscean age, and the age of Aries of individuation, of if you like, a selfish, ego-based individuation is falling away. So I think, going back to Richard's point, these evolving archetypes are absolutely vital to how we relate with them within our own psyche and our collective psyche. But my sense is they are there to help guide us, to help empower us, to help us move through this amazing birth canal of potential into, you know, the next steps as cosmic citizens, and through this incredible relationship that we have with each other, our planetary home and our solar family and the whole universe.
Jude, I have a question for you. Do you feel that there's a correlation with the Aquarian age and this being an axial age as well, and yet it's perhaps a little bit different in the sense that we have the internet now and we're communicating all over the world in a heartbeat, as opposed to maybe 4,000 years ago during an axial age, and shifting was happening in separate parts of the globe, but it was all happening at the same time without the in terms of physics, they were communicating, right? But what do you think?
Well, first of all, the axial age itself it was just a different term for what astrologers would say the Piscean age. It began roughly 2,000 to 2,500 years ago. The Piscean age around 2,160 years ago, if you talk to astrologers. So they're different terms for the same impulse coming through us. And so when we talk about, as astrologers talk about the Aquarian age, the other term that's now being used is the unitive age. So the axial age is coming to its completion in part of an ongoing evolutionary emergent process. So it and the Piscean age are coming to their completion as the Aquarian age impulse and the unitive age impulse is essentially dawning.
You feel that this dawning, if you will, is again the call?
Yes, I do think it's the call. I think it's the call. I think it's the evolutionary invitation of the universe flowing through us and us flowing through it, that impulse to evolve. That is the call. And that's the call in any hero's journey, Richard, isn't it? It's that invitation to evolve. That is the call where something in us says enough, whatever that may be. And Richard, you shared yours and I shared some of mine. And Sean and Tom, I'd love to hear from you, and perhaps Jim too. But for all of us, I suspect it may have been different in specifics, but the same in that sense of, I can't go on like this. Things have to change within me at some level, or I'm just called to a curiosity. I'm just called to an adventure, whatever it may be. That for me is the universal invitation to us all now.
Well, I would say too, what Richard was talking about, I feel that we're also being called through suffering.
Yes.
And trauma.
Yes.
And if it's not in our own lives, which is happening pretty much to someone, somehow, some way, it's happening so universally that you can't look at the news or be aware of what's going on with the world without your heart breaking. And so, Richard, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that too.
Well, I was just thinking, actually, my friend Elizabeth Sartoris is a wonderful evolution biologist, and we worked together on a conference up at the Findhorn Foundation a few years ago called the New Story Summit, Inspiring Pathways for Humanity's Future. And we brought 300 change makers together from all over the world, different nations, from shamans to policymakers to meditators to activists to singers. And it was an amazing gathering. And the idea was to cohere a new story for humanity. And no one could do it. It was heartbreaking. And at the same time, it was like it was a lesson that perhaps because the Aquarian age is going to be initially, I think, more individualistic, even though the Aquarian nature understands unitive consciousness. Many Aquarian minded people kind of want to do their own thing. It's like, I'm not going to be part of a group that would have someone like me for a member. It's a little bit of that. So the separation and the togetherness are going to be in a dance. It's not going to be a simple cohering of a new story. And it will take time. But the imagination comes in. I remember William Shakespeare's words in The Tempest, we are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. It's like we have the power to dream. And for whatever gifts in this part of the universe, we have the power of imagination. And that is magic. In fact, the word magi sitting in the middle of the word imagination is a link to the wisdom of the image, that we have to see a future before we can live into it. And right now, I feel that there are many people seeing different possible futures. And I think we're going to have to live with that diversity of story for a while. Elizabeth has this wonderful image of the butterfly on its journey from the caterpillar to the butterfly. When the caterpillar starts to die, the first thing, and I love the term for this, that emerges, they're called imaginal cells. The imaginal cells are the beginning of the birth of the butterfly. But what does the dying caterpillar do? It eats them, because those imaginal cells represent an existential threat. And I think we're in a world where there are many imaginal cells, and ubiquity and what we're all trying to do are part of those imaginal cells. But there is a big caterpillar out there that is also munching down and taking us back to the old story, make Britain great again, make America great again. I mean, that's a regression, again, tells you that we're trying to pull us back rather than move forward. So there's a big struggle, I think, between the imaginal forces for coherence in the new story. And it will take a long time for coherence to settle. But if it is the journey of the Aquarian age, then hopefully we've got 2,000 years to sort it out. But we do need to start soon. Yeah.
I agree. I guess I just add one point to that, because as systems, as a systems person as well, I know that when the underlying, what's called a tractor of a complex system, can no longer sustain itself. In other words, it's so disrupted that it is falling apart. Then the way that evolution progresses, and I've had conversations with Elizabeth, who's a dear friend too, on this, what then is occurring is a higher level of coherence, of potentiality. And if there is sufficient, if you like, coherence in that potentiality, then as the old dies away, the new comes forward. And it can happen very quickly. Another dear friend, Irvin Laszlo, talks about this as bifurcation. In other words, a system has a branch point, and it can go into breakdown or it can go to breakthrough. And sometimes it's a combination of both. And my sense is, and the other thing to add is, when that happens, something called flickering occurs. And it's when the old is falling apart, the new is, the new potential is emerging, and the system flickers between the two. And so we might consider that as part of the imaginal process as well, Richard, that the old is seeking to eat the new, but I'm sure Elizabeth said as well that it makes the butterfly stronger. When the caterpillar attacks the imaginal cells, it actually strengthens the immune system of the developing butterfly. So it seems to me that we're in that metamorphosis potential, evolutionary potential, but also it is still our collective conscious choice that brings us to that, either the bifurcation point of emergence or the bifurcation point of ultimately extinction, perhaps. And I'm rooting for emergence. And it may not take us, I'll have your side bet on this, it may not take as long as we might consider.
Mm.
Tom, you're on mute.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say I love that notion of flickering. I love that. I'm going to steal that, use that too.
Steal it, use it. I talk about it. It's my relationship with chocolate biscuits. It's a very personal example of that.
Oh, that's cute. I want to leave time for us to look at questions from the chat. Kurt had one that and Connie, you've been saying so many wonderful things in there. If I could keep up with Connie, I wish I could, but she's been really adding some wonderful things. But I have one question for Richard, and then I'm going to back off and let Tom and Jim kind of bring this wonderful party home. So Kurt had a question for you, and I hope I'm going to say this correctly, Richard. How do we express this play of consciousness in our personal team, TEEM/TEAM, and Zooming communities? How do we express this play of consciousness in our personal team and Zooming communities? Do you have thoughts on that, Richard?
Well, I think it starts with conscious intention for sure. So it's everyone in those communities willing to pay attention, to perhaps take a few minutes of silence before we start talking, perhaps tune in to a common cause, or focus on similar aspects, so that we literally, I mean, in Findhorn, they call it tuning in, attunement. before any activity has started, there is a time of tuning in, and there's also a tuning out when the activity is finished. And certainly it's not something I practice in every meeting I do, but I notice the difference in the ones where it is practiced, to call consciousness present and to be aware of something else that might be trying to guide us in the conversation rather than us running the show. So creating space for something other to come in however we do it. And we obviously, because we use the archetypes as a shorthand in our company, so that we can say, and someone might say, okay, we're getting a bit strategic now. Could we just pause? Could we hear a poem? Could we sit quietly for 5 minutes? Could we have a break? Whatever it is. So you can notice that archetypes will become dominant in any conversation, and sometimes rightfully so, because people are getting together and they want to fix something and they're in kind of strategist warrior mode. But other times, to consciously call people out of an archetypal pattern that is running the show in an unhelpful way, simply kind of calling it, naming it. Could we try a little bit of X? Because we seem to be on the Y stream at the moment, can be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to invite you, Richard, to share another poem with us as we bring Jim back into help us wrap up for today.
Thank you. This is another one of my favorite pieces, called "Turn on Your Light" by Ben Okri. The new era is already here. Here, the new time begins anew. The new era happens every day. Every day is a new world, a new calendar. All great moments, all great eras are just every moment and every day writ large. Thousands of years of loving, failing, killing, creating, surprising, oppressing, and thinking ought now to start to bear fruit, to deliver their rich harvest. Will you be at the harvest, among the gatherers of new fruits? Then you must begin today to remake your mental and spiritual world. Join the warriors and celebrants of freedom, the realizers of great dreams. You can't remake the world without remaking yourself. Each new era begins within. It is an inward event with unsuspected possibilities for inner liberation. We could use it to turn on our inward lights. We could use it to use even the dark and negative things positively. We could use the new era to clean our eyes, to see the world differently, to see ourselves more clearly. Only free people can make a free world. Infect the world with your light. Help fulfill the golden prophecies. Press forward the human genius. Our future is greater than our past.
Thank you, Richard. Welcome back, Jim.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Richard and Jude and Sean. I've been just marveling at the nuances that have been unfolding over the last hour about the nature of consciousness and cosmology. And I want to just probe one of the assertions of Carl Jung about archetypes, and maybe starting with you, Richard, and then have your comment, Jude. For Jung, as I understand him, not all archetypes are equal. That you have this paradox that all archetypes are available, but it is one's choice of an archetype that determines one's fate. And you'll be familiar, I'm sure, with his analysis of Germany in the 1930s, where he said there was a very specific archetypal formation, the archetype of Wotan, that was emerging in the collective German consciousness, while consciously the Germans thought they were in another archetype. They were the most civilized, Christianized, technologized country in the world at that time. And they were caught up in this highly secular, technocratic archetype, while boiling up from the collective unconscious was a ferociousness that overthrew the secular strictures of their collective consciousness and swept the world away. And so, I would wonder at this time of acute duress for the world, where, as Jung said in his essays after the Second World War, we are increasingly collectively being gripped by the archetype of Antichrist. That after the 2,000 years of the age of Pisces, we're originating with the light of Christ. 2,000 years later, we have gone through this great enantiodromia, and now we're being gripped by the opposite, by the archetype of Antichrist. And I'm just wondering, given the precariousness of the world, we see this Antichrist consciousness all over. What, out of your understanding of the full spectrum of archetypes that are available to us, what archetype should we be cultivating at this time? Because we're certainly, by any reckoning, no longer in normal times. We're in acutely precarious times. So from a Jungian point of view, we have to choose very carefully what archetypes we begin to embody, because our survival, as the poem was just saying, quite literally depends on it. So I was just wondering if you had to pick one or a cluster of archetypes that are the most appropriate at this time, where we slouch toward Bethlehem, what would that be? What comment would you make on that?
Well, there are a few things. I mean, what a wonderful, rich question. There's a part of it that, the archetype of the time. So, there is right now that there is Jupiter is coming into the equation. The explorer is coming in. There is an opportunity in conjunction with Uranus, with the renegade, for radical big new ideas to emerge. And some people might be called to jump into literally the zeitgeist of this year and next year. And Rick Tarnas talks about this brilliantly. But there are moods, there are archetypal moods that we can get in tune with them and enhance them. Then we are in the age of Aquarius, which is for me the renegade archetype. We need to be prepared to do things differently, to not conform to the old ways, not necessarily to do things the way that people think they ought to be done, and to be willing to break the mold and try new things. And then on a very personal level, for personal healing, any of the archetypes could be useful. So that there are people I work with who really need to step into a warrior in order to claim their rightful place in the world, or in their community, or in their workplace. And there are people who need to embrace the sovereign, even though, on a global level, we've probably had way too much, but the inner sovereign that allows them to shine and to be center stage for the right reason, and to hold a vision that others can gather around. I think all the archetypes would be useful to different individuals. So that would be my quicker answer to your very rich question. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a quick follow-up question and then have you comment, Jude. But I was really struck, Richard, by your account that you had gone to this conference and they were looking for narratives that could possibly unite humanity, and sadly they concluded there weren't any. Well, in that context, I want to raise what I'm doing in Washington, because I think there is an emerging archetypal formation at that level, but also emerging fact situation that, in my mind, and I think the mind of many people, is potentially a unifying narrative, and that is the process now that is going on with the U.S. government to begin, starting in January of next year, a 7-year controlled disclosure of all the evidence pertaining to unidentified flying objects. And the assertion that is being made increasingly clearly by the government that essentially humanity is not alone, that extraterrestrial intelligences exist. They've been on planet Earth for some time, and there's actual evidence, spacecraft, alien bodies, other artifacts that have actually been collected by various governments and contracting corporations. And it intuitively feels to me that what's going on around the emergence of this awareness that humanity is not alone would enable all of humanity, which is getting this information at the same time, given the internet, to begin collectively to look up for the first time in our collective history and begin the next phase, the Aquarian phase, shall we call it, of interactivity with civilizations and intelligences that are distinctly non-human. And that's what I'm doing here in Washington. And I would just wonder at your sense, and then also yours, Jude, and love to hear from you, Sean and Tom, about the potential of this new consciousness, which is actually emerging from the very government that's causing most of the problems. It's quite extraordinary from a Jungian point of view, the synchronicity of disclosure at a time of imperial collapse.
I mean, I'm happy to respond to that, Richard. I don't know how close you are in on that. Yeah, okay. I've been pretty close in this because about 40 years ago, I was guided that this would be a time when we would remember our extraterrestrial, intraterrestrial, human, and cosmic heritage. So it's like all of these threads are coming forward as part of this evolutionary impulse and remembering process, Jim, to sort of respond to that point. They're all part of this confluence and convergence of this invitation, it seems to me. I'd just like to make a couple of points going back to what was said about what you said about Nazi Germany and Jung, because I think what then, and as a student of history for the last 10,000 years, you know, after the First World War, Germany had lost a reason to believe in itself. And I think that all of these impulses in some way or other, and often it can be very shadow-based, is a quest to have meaning and purpose and a sense of belonging. And that can play out in very benevolent ways. It can play out in incredibly tragic and disruptive and destructive ways. But I think it's also part of that impulse and that evolutionary process. The other thing I wanted to come back to was this concept of the sovereign archetype, because I think I said something earlier that may not have been heard, which is when we actually are at peace with that archetype, and that inner sense of sovereignty becomes what I call serveranty. It actually expresses itself as servant leadership, rather than that, you know, stick a crown on me and whatever. And you can have a crown on your head and still be a servant leader. But I think that that's the evolutionary aspect of the sovereign. It's both a visionary, but it's also that visionary in service now to the potential good of the whole. And the other thing I'd like to perhaps complete on is going back to what Richard said about the dreamer, because dreamers are vital to at the initial impulse of transformational change. It seems to me the transformer is, the storyteller is, the dreamer is. And for me now, the transformer can help us heal our collective trauma, the storyteller can help tell a new story in a unitive narrative, which is why I prefer to call it as the dawning of the unitive age, because I think it's deeper somehow than the Aquarian age. I think this is much more than just another 2,160-year-old cycle throughout the zodiac. I think this is the first time that we as a collective species have had this opportunity to evolve together. So I would also like to really make a shout out for the dreamer, and perhaps to finish with John Lennon's words. Basically, imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one. That for me is our hope and our potential.
Beautifully put, Jude. Beautifully put. Maybe that's a good point with which to wrap this up. Sean, any final comment? And then Tom, why don't you tee us up for tomorrow?
Thanks, Jim. After that, I think that a moment of appreciation and silence for all of you, I think, is. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Richard and Jude. It's just delightful to have you with us today to kick off this extraordinary week. And the conversation was beyond what I had hoped we were going to have today, and it certainly helps frame our conversation for the week. Tomorrow we're going to be, whether we're prepared for it or not, we will be receiving an invitation to begin our journey. And so thank you for the framing today, the richness of the conversation, the perspectives, and look forward to having you all with us again tomorrow as we continue this exploration of conscious leadership in the context of the evolution of humanity and the state of the world.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Jude. Thank you, Sean. This has been a very rich conversation, deeply appreciative. That'll bring us to a close for today, everyone. You're welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the chat link in the chat box. You also received it in your Zoom invite for today's program. And then we'll see you all again tomorrow for day 2 of our 5-day program on conscious leadership. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.